Welcome to the Savage World's GM Hangout. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's episode, in honor of Valentine's Day, we're going to discuss romanticism. Welcome to the Savage World's GM. Stand by. If you want to follow us on social media, we're at Facebook and Twitter at SWGM Podcast. You can join and follow the YouTube channel at YouTube/Savage World's GM Podcast. We're the same moniker on iTunes /Savage World's GM Podcast. If you enjoy what we do and want to get behind the show, throw us a buck on Patreon, patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. And last but not least, if you're watching the live show, the live broadcast tonight, the live stream, feel free to participate in the chat. We do bring that into the show. Nailed it! Okay, so here to discuss tonight's topic, we're going to go in reverse order. Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith.
Hello, comrades. Happy Capitalist Card Giving Day.
Dave, the Rules Maven Scott.
You know, I'm just surviving over-commercialized Love Day.
And Chris, the Savage Mommy Fox. Great pod. Okay.
Glorious pod, comrades.
Yeah, that's what I got to say about this day.
So what do we mean when we're talking about romanticism? Are we talking about putting, bringing sexuality into your role-playing games?
Getting weird.
No.
Getting jiggy.
No. Yeah, we're not talking about making a persuasion roll to get jiggy. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the literary movement of the late 1800s. And believe it or not, a lot of role-playing, a lot of movies, a lot of media still embrace a lot of the concepts of romanticism. Go ahead, Dave. You look like you wanted to throw something on that.
I was just going to say, I thought it was all about getting it on.
Please to be telling me you have good athletics for this persuasion roll.
No, we're not talking about, but that's not what we're talking about. This isn't a ladies man episode. So what we're talking about are some basic concepts, some prevalent ideas, cliches, trappings, ideologies, and how they are if you take a look at Suede, especially as an example of a role-playing game, they're kind of baked in when you take a look at it. Heroism, for example, the whole concept of the classic hero, springs from romanticism. The whole idea of rebellion. And I'm going to give Dustin a pass on this one. So if he wants to bring Star Wars in, he can talk about it. But the idea of rebelling against an unjust or tyrannical, government, that's romanticism.
Well, there goes the neighborhood. So I think an interesting thing to kind of address before we get too far out of the gate here is that it's going to sound a lot tonight like we're either against some of this stuff or that it's overdone. But I think a big part of this to remember is that most of the reason that this stuff exists in the hobby is because this is an escape hobby. This hobby is about using your imagination to go and do something that your body wouldn't be capable of in the real world, which is, to a certain extent, the definition of romanticism is you're making the world more romantic, a little bit better, a little, the shiny, happier version of you falling off of that tightrope and wracking yourself.
I was worried for just a sec that we were going to talk about weird body positions.
I think it definitely speaks to the fact that as a culture, specifically following the sexual revolution, it's sort of, we've lost the concept of an emotional sense of romance. Like, we have become a very physically romantic culture, when specifically the romantic period is where we got a lot of genre defining moments. A lot of our tropes, our heroes and our anti-heroes, and the aesthetics involved come from the romantic period, not just in terms of romance, but also in terms of horror.
Yep.
Well,
so let's talk about the horror aspect.
The whole horror romance aspect. Look at Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's really a romantic horror film when you get right down to it.
So I'm going to tell you something.
Even beyond the overt romantic tones in that, the romanticism of Dracula as a myth, where you're talking about a character who we see the depth of despair through this character. This idea of immortality is not a blessing, but a curse. You're suffering the loss of this thing that you love so deeply, and you get a reminder of it every few decades. Through each generation, there's another Mina that comes along to kind of re-break his heart and re-emphasize that curse. You know, a lot of people, when they talk about the romanticism of the vampire myths, they kind of stop at this whole the suave, debonair, you know, thing that's portrayed. But really, when you look a little bit deeper, like the romanticism of that story is about the constant despair of being that character and kind of what it would be like to have an unending life and an unending suffering of all of your regrets.
Yeah.
Right. Well, even to the point too, there's a romantic ideal with Dracula as well. When he finds someone who reminds him of that lost love, he obsesses about it, and puts him and goes through falling in love and romantic courtship all over again. Even in his own twisted Dracula way, he's still courting the new Mina, this woman that he's imprinted on as his lost love found again. And even to the point where she begs him to turn her into a vampire, he's torn and twisted with the idea that he can't do that to somebody he loves. Don't tempt me. But at the same time, that's exactly what he wants. And this is an example of what we're talking about when we're talking about romanticism. You see it very, very heavily foot forward in a lot of Victorian stories in the Victorian era. It's really, really prevalent and prominent in that genre.
A lot of the classic literature that came out of the Victorian era is kind of the default mode is romanticism. Yeah. And to a certain extent, because so much, especially of our horror fiction, is still rooted in that, we see that trickles down into not just Dracula and obviously Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but also later on into things like the more modern version of like Penny Dreadful, where they took the old Penny Dreadful stories and found a way to knit them all together into this cohesive thing on Netflix that was an amazingly Victorian and amazingly classic piece of fiction, but it was very modern in its delivery and obviously kind of the mentality of the people telling that story. So we got a romanticism on a modern take on a classic story, which was very interesting if you took that step back and didn't just enjoy it, but actually kind of ripped it apart.
And of course, I was waiting for somebody to bring up Twilight.
Guys, I gotta say something before we go any further. Dracula is a good example of a story that is originally just sheer terror and cosmic horror and an invasion fantasy that gradually embraced the romantic aspects and got more popular as it did. The first written recorded Dracula is effectively found footage of the 1800s, and the Count is just a monster. It didn't go anywhere at all until they started the play, and at first he was just horrible. He was Nosferatu, and it was a failure. But then they put him in a tuxedo, and they cleaned up the actor, and suddenly people started coming in droves. And over time, the character of Count Dracul became a more and more romantic figure until we get Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a masterpiece.
Oh, yeah.
So I think there's an aspect there that when you take that step back and remember kind of what we're talking about is, again, most literature, most theater is all about escapism, just like our hobby. So it makes sense that we don't want to escape to a world that's worse than our own. And I mean, to take this to a different level, I want to talk about kind of the ideals that we see in something like The Walking Dead, or obviously the upcoming Dead End when we release it. Is this idea that as bad as the world gets, there's always hope. There's always heroic characters that are out there doing this interesting, creative, survival-oriented stuff. You know, Rick is kind of your ultimate romantic hero in that he keeps who he is despite the fact the world is gone. And I think that it's this classic note that can be changed through everything. John Wick, ultimate action hero character, and the entire movie is about a man who is heartbroken because he lost his dog and his wife. That is a very romantic note that drives what is probably the best action film we've had in recent history.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the dog, a lot of people laugh because John Wick is killing people for a dog. He's not killing people for the dog. The dog was the last gift. It's a memento. It's the last shred.
It's that last link to the lost wife.
And literally the entire period of her suffering just gets crammed together, and that's the one thread that cuts it. And he just unleashes all of that suffering through the pain of watching her die and through the pain of being absolutely powerless. And he is the wrath of God on those people because all of that build up, and he finally has an outlet, and I'm back.
So Art Fernandez, one of our Patreon supporters, asks, what about romance in spy films? And so there's romance in spy films, and then there's romanticism in spy films. The romance in spy films, to me, is the lie. That's the part of the James Bonds and the other spy films that is there to ground it in this idea of bad simulation reality. And we all know it. It's done in such a fashion where when you're watching James Bond bed the 19th Bond girl, everyone knows that it wouldn't happen that way. Either from the female perspective or the male perspective, we all know that's not the way it's going to work. But then the romantic note is when you see James Bond save the Bond girl while driving the car backwards on the highway, firing a machine gun, and holding the detonator in his teeth. Like, that's that escapism romantic level thing that's happening there, where the character is so much larger than life. Yeah, it truly can't happen, but it's got a different note to it than well, he's just going to take her to bed. There's just something about that he's just going to take her to bed that doesn't hit the same romantic note that we're talking about. Yes, it's a romance in the definition sense of the word, but it's not the romantic part of that character. The romantic part of the character is that he's doing these amazing things and he can actually pull them off.
I'm gonna add this to that too, real quick too. It's the romance, quote unquote, that's being presented in a James Bond film is very surface, and it's really seduction. It's really a spy technique. It's a seduction, and both parties are aware of it, but they're pretending and acting and playing it off as, oh, this is just a romantic encounter. They're going through all the romantic steps, the champagne, the roaring fire, all of that, all the trappings of a romantic encounter, but it's all under the guise of disguise. It's all under a disguise of seduction to find something out or get something to move the plot forward. And you can tell by the way it's written that both people involved are completely aware that this is not a deep emotional attachment romance.
I think something that a lot of people, especially like in the latest Daniel Craig series, that people are kind of missing out on is how James Bond does not care about any of there are two women that James Bond, or three, okay. There's three women that James Bond cares about. M, which is effectively his mother figure for most of the for the first two films. Vesper, who conned him, but I think he really did love her. And every other woman that he's been with, he was burned so bad with Vesper that it is just like you said, Jared. He is just going there as a technique to get to the people that cost him Vesper. And then Moneypenny, who he has that sort of back and forth with, but there's a little bit more equality between them. There's a little bit more of almost brotherly, sisterly, but then at the same time, there is a little bit of tension between the two of them.
Right. It's really like playful banter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at least to me, this is where, unfortunately, the word itself becomes the problem in the conversation. Because the romanticism in James Bond has nothing to do with most of those things.
Right.
That's the romance
Mhm.
part of James Bond, which, to be fair, there's a romantic aspect to that character of how tragic he was hurt in the older story, which we don't see really until the later kind of movies where we actually get to touch on that core original story of the character. And then you see kind of how it wrecks his love life. Everyone becomes this, one night stand, 1 week stand kind of a thing. It turns him into a tragic character while he's also the hero that's single-handedly saving the world. And that's the romanticism part of this.
That is because there is a huge element of tragedy in romanticism. Going back to it, the Byronic hero is always kind of tragic. The frontier hero has to deal with the unknown. The trickster hero has to outwit a much more powerful force through the use of deceit. And yeah, the tragedy sort of creates the romanticism aspect.
So Chris, you posted a definition. Go ahead and read it out for everybody.
Yeah, I just kind of look at while we're talking just to kind of see some definitions. So the one I found is just a movement in the arts and literature originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual.
And so Mark Brown says that he feels like that we lost romanticism in the 80s in lieu of nonstop action. And I think he's completely wrong. And where I want to push back on that is, I think in the 80s, we doubled and tripled down on this romantic hero who is tragic, who is flawed. Take a look at, a great example of like the classic 80s pulp action film would be Die Hard.
Right.
And what we see in this is we see a man who's literally broken physically, emotionally, and mentally by saving the world. He's there. He's at the end of his marriage with his wife and knows it. They are living bi-coastally. He lives in New York. She lives in LA. And he flew out for the holiday. And you can tell by the things that they have the character doing early on in the movie when he's getting off the plane, getting into the limo, he's talking about what he's going to do to try to win his wife back. And then the entire movie, you get this sense that everything John McClane is doing, well, yeah, it's grounded in the fact he's a cop, is also to impress his damn wife and save her and her bosses so that he can get her back. It's this classic romantic idea of the tragic hero. And that is, again, this is where I think the 80s doubled or even tripled down on it to the point that people lost the idea of what romanticism was because it got boiled down into tropes. And, we talk a lot today about memes. Well, memes have existed since the dawn of time, and romanticism is in and of itself the classic definition of the word meme. It's something that sets, a tone that we can all look at in a snapshot and understand a much larger picture. And these characters kind of became an even more boiled down single scene snapshot during the 80s and 90s. And now we're starting to see some more of that come back as far as good art. But I think really what it is it's drawing back away from pure versions of these and making more three-dimensional characters that aren't just a trope any longer.
Right. Well, and the thing too that I'm sorry, go ahead, Dustin.
I was going to say, like, what does Hans Gruber keep referring to John McClane as? Cowboy. Cowboys were one of the biggest romantic heroes of our era. Yeah. The whole idea of the white hat versus the black hat. In fact, there are different versions of it. You have High Noon, where a man is got to choose between his wife, who's got her convictions, and his convictions. You've got like the spaghetti westerns, where the man with no name is legitimately the quintessential anti-hero, but he's still got that romantic, everything's got a price and a man's got to stand for something. You got U.S. Marshals. You got Rooster Cogburn. Fill your hands, you son of a bitch, is probably one of the best lines in all cinema ever.
Yeah, well, and also too, there's a romanticism to the Old West. So we're talking about romanticism. There's this. Why does everybody want to play Deadlands? Let's talk about that for a second, because
it's awesome.
Well, it's awesome. Yeah.
I mean, yes.
Yeah. But there's a certain attraction that comes from the romanticized idea of life in the Old West. Lawlessness, where a man was free to pursue his own destiny, open range,
so
free land everywhere.
And actually look at what is the definition of a romanticized version of something. And Deadlands makes a great example of this, because we can say, well, the romanticized version of the Wild West is that everyone had a 6-gun on their hip. Right. And we have, some rules in the book about dueling, and we have the grit stat and things like that you can buy. When in reality, if you walked into a town in the Old West, you checked your guns at the door. Like, there was a sign that said, stop at the sheriff's office and drop off your gun, and you could pick it back up on the way out of town. And if you didn't, the sheriff would catch you with that, and it would be a fine, and he would confiscate the gun. There was a chance you wouldn't even get it back at that point. And that could be more expensive than even the fine was for continuing to carry the weapon inside a town. Like, that's a reality. That's a fact of the way the West was. There were more laws during that time period regarding who could have a firearm and where they could have it than there are even now. And yet we have this romantic ideal of everyone carrying a 6-gun. Those are the things I think that people miss when we start talking about a romanticized version of a setting.
Yeah. Well, you get it in Pirates too. So if you're going to play something in the Age of Sail, there's a romanticized trope and version of that. The swashbuckling, carefree pirate hero is romanticized.
Who never got scurvy.
Right. Yeah. Never got scurvy. Nobody ever has cholera or dysentery. Yeah.
Yeah. Captain Jack Sparrow and Mr. Gibbs are great romantic characters when you stand them next to the likes of William Kidd, who was a pirate captain in the classic sense of he led a ship to sea. He had a letter of marque allowing him to attack the vessels of another nation, and that letter was not valid. So he attacks another ship, sinks it because his ship was sinking from rotted planks, sails back to town, and is immediately clapped in irons, thrown on another boat, taken halfway around the world to England, and then hung in a gibbet at the edge of the Thames. This man committed one act of privateering, which was called piracy, and ended his life after a long career as a sea captain. Like, piracy in our games, in our movies, in our literature looks nothing like it actually occurred in history.
Right.
Oh no, you swing it, you see all the people swinging from the ropes up in the sails and the rigging and leaping from ship to ship. And yeah, I think it's not exactly, but I think if you wanted to see how pirating was done, I think Black Sails was a pretty good example of that.
Right,
Yeah.
but even
Black
Black
Sails is a
Sails.
lot more simulationist, but even that is
But-
highly romanticized.
Yeah.
Sure, it was. Yeah. Oh, it was.
Right.
I,
And there's a certain expectation of that too, right? So when you say, "Oh, this is a pirate quote unquote movie, novel, book," you kind of have to pander to those romanticized ideals because otherwise people are going to go, "That pirate book sucked."
Guys, I'm not gonna lie. I grew up an hour away from Wilmington, North Carolina. And do you know who was the most infamous pirate to sail through that particular area? Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard the Pirate, captain of Queen Anne's Revenge. And we still fear him to this day because that man was decapitated and his headless body swam around the ship looking for his head. He used to put things in his beard and set it on fire
Slow fuse.
and lead the charge onto other ships and just go crazy. Blackbeard was no joke. And a lot of that is myth, but then there are also points where people say, no, this is not a myth. I love how, like, in some of the history of that era, there are literally sections where the writer will say, this is not a myth.
So Art Fernandez wants to know, how do we include romanticism in our games when we have mixed characters and players and not go too far to have it overflow and cause problems? And I'm going to add something to his question. How do you do it without railroading your players?
I'll go ahead and tell you. What I do is I think of the villain's motivation. And a lot of times my villains will try to get the heroes on their side. Whether it's like a greater demon who wants to recruit the party to like reverse time, or whether it's like a deranged cult leader who thinks his faith is going to save humanity. Like, if you can actually come up with a villain who thinks that they're doing the right thing and make a plausible case, you can have a romantic villain.
I'm going to say the first thing you do is you get player buy-in to the idea. Number one, you say, "Hey, look, I know we're role playing and we're doing this thing. I want to really embrace the romanticized ideals in the narrative. We're not using necessarily no special rules in Savage Worlds to reinforce that because they're already there. You want to talk about swashbuckling as a romanticized ideal? It's already in Savage Worlds. There's already core rules for that. You want to talk about the hero? It's in there. You want to talk about the chaste, pure paladin character? Yeah, that's already in there. It's called Miracles. Or I think now it's called Gifted, right? Is it still Miracles?
We still have
Miracles.
Yeah,
there's
Gifted
Miracles.
replace superpowers.
Yeah, where you have sins, major sins, minor sins, and just bringing those things back into focus for the players and the characters. It's more about the players more than anything else. And I would say a very simple way to do it without being heavy-handed is, number one, demonstrate it with your NPCs and demonstrate it with the way the world reacts to the player characters. Number one. Number two, stop in the middle and go, I just have a question. How does your character feel about this decision morally? Does it align with his morals? Is that really heroic? And then, you say, I'm not telling you can't do it. I'm just asking the question, and just sort of bring those things back forefront. And I think you can do it without railroading, but you have to have players that want to do it. I mean, you can't get a bunch of murder hobos around the table and go, no, we're going to play with the romanticized ideal of a knight. No, he's just going to be a murder hobo, killing people and taking shit.
I'm just here to kill. Yeah, say I'm just here to kill shit. This is my night to let loose and murderize things.
Right. So, there's a maiden trapped in a burning building. Screw that bitch. I got to kill the dragon and get some money. That's not a romanticized.
Well, it is. I mean, I don't want to make out like everything you guys are saying is wrong, but absolutely, the murder hobo play style is still a romanticism aspect of the game, because
yeah,
you're taking this character who would absolutely be thrown in jail for the very first action they ever took of this type, and turning them into the centralized hero who's going to save the world. Because that's what the GM's always running. I mean, let's be honest. 99 games out of every 100, the player characters are saving the world. I personally hate that style. I never run it for my players because you guys are just plebes. You're not the one hero who saves the world. You're just somebody else stopping something from happening locally. You're not saving the world. But 99 games out of 100 are the player characters are going to save the world. And it doesn't matter what methods they use to get there. They're still going to be held up on this romantic pedestal as the ones who saved the world. So even your murder hobos can be, it's the romantic group of savages who saved the world by being barbarians and just raffle stomping every goblin and orc and dragon that gets in the way. But at the same time, like, there's an aspect here where I think, Jared, you're absolutely right. If you want to get the heroic romanticism in there, you can just use AAA games setting rule, heroes act heroic. And every time a player takes an action that's not heroic, they owe the GM a Benny. And if you run out of bennies because you had to turn them all over for these, non-heroic actions, you can't earn any more bennies that session. It's a slightly punishing setting rule, but only if you've got a player who doesn't buy in to playing a romantic hero character. And if everybody signed on for that, then that setting rule just reinforces this idea that there's no room to be an anti-hero. There's no room to be a bad guy in this style of play. It's neither good or bad. It works to reinforce a certain way of play. But I think that's another way that you could take something extra to lay over top of Savage Worlds. I think Savage Worlds by itself, though, already does the whole romantic ideal of the character just by having you pick character flaws that are going to make your character a little bit better than everybody else. We call those hindrances, and the points you get that make you, better than the average human being.
What about you, Chris? Any comment on the? No,
not really.
Okay. So let's talk about maybe one of the most rebellion. Let's go back to that idea that there are certain things that are just right and morally correct, and there's certain things that are just wrong and evil, meaning that you have really big bad intent because it's not just evil, it's evil.
So wait a minute. Radicalizing the farm boy whose parents were killed by the police because they were holding on to secret military plans they should never have had, and convincing him to go off and save the galaxy by having him attack the police and then later blow up a police station.
Like it.
I don't know. This doesn't sound good to me.
It sounds like a horrible idea, especially when you consider all of the independent contractors that we lost.
Well, to quote a wise person once said, "It all depends on your point of view."
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. Obi-Wan Kenobi was the true villain of that series.
Oh, he's a manipulating son of a bitch.
Because he just lies to everybody. Oh, no, I've never seen this droid. Well, your father would have wanted you to have it, he said as he was falling into lava, screaming.
I love that Saibaku immediately goes, Shogun! Because Lucas ripped fucking Shogun off so bad.
Hidden Fortress. It's Hidden Fortress, man.
So
Not ripped off. Hold on. Inspired.
I would say inspired by. Yes, inspired by.
Inspired.
Yeah.
So
I just want to say
the rebellion story can certainly be romantic because you're talking about the classic underdog who is fighting for everything right in the world, and therefore you've got that classic good versus evil, black-white dichotomy.
Yeah, rising above being downtrodden. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can see that even outside of like a Star Wars, but you could see that even in like the original Rocky, where the entire thing is about a character who at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, loses. He doesn't win. But it's this classic, like, gonna rebel against the system and show them that anybody can do this. When in the end, I mean, he goes the distance, but he doesn't. Right. He is beat by the man.
Well, so, only because the judges were bought off.
But I mean, you can do a classic rebellion story, and it can be very romantic in nature. But I think you have to be very careful as the GM when presenting that to the players, that there is a romantic ideal behind the rebellion. There has to be something for them to fight for that makes that whole thing tie together. Otherwise, you can have romantic moments, but unless there's a romantic ideal that acts as kind of the backbone of your narrative, the rebellion story can fall apart very quickly from a romanticism standpoint.
So let's try this as a thought exercise. We're going to run Braveheart, the Savage Worlds campaign. Mm-hmm. And we're going to emphasize the romanticism elements of it. So let's take a look at, well, I don't know, the main hero, the Mel Gibson character, right? William
Wallace.
William Wallace.
Who was not Braveheart, by the way. I just learned that.
Yep.
So the main character of the movie, wife raped and murdered by the government. Tragic
wife
hero.
Had taken secret.
Right.
Because of the bad laws of the government about what would happen to her just for being his wife.
Right.
Yep.
So there you have a tragic hero figure who then, because of the loss of his wife and the injustice, decides, you know what? Freedom. We're going to kick the English the hell out of here. Now, who are the romanticized ideal supporting cast or the other player characters in that campaign? My favorite being the guy who talks to God.
The Irishman is amazing in that way.
I love that character.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have kind of the classic kind of figurehead and the aide de camp around him that are going to, bolster him up and act as his lieutenants and carry him to victory. You've got the classic, big man. You've got the classic strategist. You kind of have the formation to a certain extent of the 5-man band trope. You get the big guy and the smart guy, and you've got the female offshoot to the main. So you've got that trope fairly well handled, and I think because of that, I would say the 5-man band lends itself well to a romantic when we're talking about a game, because it means that you're taking on these classic kind of role avenues within the story. And if you can get your players to sign into that, I think that's why we see D&D is kind of held up as this, behemoth in the industry, not just of being kind of the big first game out there, but it's held up a lot by the tropes that it's built on, because the classes are built very much to reinforce that stay in your lane and tell your part of the story. We talk a lot on the show about, not being on rails and not railroading your characters. D&D railroads players to play a very specific path by the restraints of what your class can do and what your class can't do. So I think that reinforces the romantic side of that particular game. So if you get your players to sign into that in Savage Worlds, I think it can absolutely work fairly well.
Now they may be all rebel rousers and outliers of society, but they're kind of like Robin Hood's men, right? Morally upright.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if you're trying to do a romantic game, they have to be morally upright. You can't really do a romantic game with kind of morally gray characters.
Right. But you can still have a ladies' man, right? You can still have a face character who, is always chasing pardon the term, but it's appropriate, a bar wench, always chasing the farmer's daughter, always trying to have a romantic quote unquote interlude with any available female in the area. But he's still not considered a bad guy, right? He's not going to steal from you. He just got this one little weakness, he's passionate.
I think what's really funny is if you look at it, they sort of subvert and yet reinforce romanticism with the story of Don Quixote. Because he literally takes, like you said, a bar wench and acts like she's a princess.
Mm-hmm.
He sings her songs. He goes to fight windmills because they're giants. He is so far into this romantic, chivalrous idea that he can't see the world outside of it. But yeah, you're right. There is a lot of that going on in Don Quixote. He has this problem of how he views the world, and that lends to the character.
So let's talk about so in the framework of romanticism, where does romance fall?
It's the idea that the characters hold. It's the aesthetic and the concepts, the motivation, the ideas, the feeling and the theme behind their life script.
No, I'm talking about.
He's talking about that. You're actually talking about like
the common concept,
romances.
Yeah. Right?
Where do those fall within a romantic story?
Right. They're usually courtly love, right? They're usually the ideals of chivalry, courtly love, serenading.
Think of Guinevere and Lancelot.
Right.
I was going to say Guinevere and Lancelot is another romantic idea of the star-crossed lovers. This idea that it's not the romance is denied by something, whether it's your station, whether it's your role.
Fate.
Character who so another classic example, take a character who takes maybe code of honor in the game and then put them in a position where their love of their life is denied them based on that code of honor.
Right.
A great example of that might be to talk about something we've already touched on, maybe Pirates of the Caribbean, where you've got the two characters, and I for the life of me can't think of their names.
Will and Elizabeth.
And because of their position in society, they absolutely do not have the ability to be together because of that code of honor. Chris, you just came up with a great one. Go right ahead. Yeah.
We're thinking about this, and it's going to be the people are going to go, gross, the weird kind of that. But Cersei and Jaime.
Yeah.
If you think about Cersei and Jaime, you've got that whole. That's some romance going right there.
Oh my God, Games of Thrones is a total romanticism. It's a total monument to romanticism and what we're talking about, right? Absolutely.
Yes.
Art threw up the best one that I can think of is Batman and Catwoman.
It's good.
Yeah, because Batman is driven, like he's all about justice, and he sleeps in justice pajamas, he eats justice cereal, he just lives it. And here is this antithesis to his whole belief, Catwoman, who's a thief, and she gets under his skin, and he does the same with her. I love the Telltale Batman series And people are like, Telltale's not games, man. I'm like, it's great because they get those characters so right. So right.
Not an existing game maker anymore. It's more
Yeah, they died. But
so
the Telltale
well, let's hold on for a second. Let's talk about Star Wars for a second, Dustin. Han Solo, Princess Leia, Empire Strikes Back.
So
yes,
go. That's a whole thing of him courting Leia the whole time.
And he does it so great because, pardon my French, Leia being a princess is just so used to everybody kissing her ass. Everybody.
This is a reversal on what we were just talking about, though. We had put forward the idea of kind of the star-crossed lovers, the lovers denied. Star Wars actually puts you in a position where these are lovers that are not being denied anything, but they're choosing to deny themselves that because it's more important to deal with what's in front of them than to deal with what's between the two of them. Too often what we see in Star Wars being highlighted with those two characters is more we don't have time to deal with our love right now. Instead, we have to deal with Darth Vader and the Empire. Leia can't save Han from the carbonite because if she does, if she fights back against Vader when they're getting ready to put Han on the carbonite, they're all going to be killed. And that hurts the rebellion. It takes away her opportunity to escape and to come back to save him later. It takes away the opportunity to stop them later on. So she has to submit to that. And this is where instead of having star-crossed lovers, we have this ultimate romance of the self-sacrificing lovers who are going to put their love on hold for the good of everyone else.
And she also couldn't save him because then we wouldn't have the Jabba throne room scene and and bikini Leia.
Right. Well, and here's the thing I'm really trying to emphasize with the whole Star Wars Empire Strikes Back thing. You see Han Solo romantically pursuing her and her consistently pushing him away and saying, I'm not interested. You're gross. You're disgusting. And he just takes that as affirmation that he's on the right track and just keeps pursuing harder. It's that courtly love idea that he's found somebody he wants to have a romantic relationship with and is pursuing her.
But I love how he pursues her.
Exactly.
It's not one of those like, I'm going to grovel at your feet. It's more like, I am just going to demean you.
Yeah, jab. Yeah,
that's what he does.
Jabs.
Right.
And she needed that because he's the only one that actually like puts things in perspective.
Yeah, the whole Your Highness and
he's like, I love you. I know.
Yeah, and then you get that great line. Oh my God, it's just a perfect line. It's so in character.
And that was improv too.
Yeah, I know.
That was really just Harrison Ford being a jerk that day.
Yeah, he would just say, I know.
So I want to take a step back and just say I really appreciate how deep the hobby goes to a certain extent, because consider what we're talking about. We're talking about, an 18th century kind of ideal behind art and literature that is still in our movies today. We're still playing games about it today. But I mean, we're sitting here watching in chat. I don't know if you guys are paying attention as this conversation is going on. But I mean, people are getting references to Sherlock Holmes, to Romeo and Juliet, and at the same time references to Star Trek and Jim Kirk. I mean, the sheer breadth of what our hobby touches on in these manners lets us not only tackle some fairly heavy ideas, but to tackle them with a lot of fun thrown in. Because it doesn't matter if you want to boil down to the Romeo-Juliet version of Star-Crossed Lovers, or if you want to tell an Arthurian legend, or if you want to just, sit and play space pirates, you can have romanticism in your game. It doesn't matter how deep you want to go, just by romanticizing a few ideas such as treasure, combat, making sure that you have florid descriptions of what happens when they're twirling their swords around doing things they would never do in an actual duel. that alone brings romanticism into your game. And I think it's just amazing to me that just in our fans who are interacting in chat, much less the wider, hobby, we're doing this on a day-to-day basis in the hobby, not even thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing too. The whole ideals of romanticism are so interwoven at this point into modern storytelling and modern media that they're inescapable. Even in the confines of our hobby, of what we do, they're inescapable. And I think, like, if you want to take a really good look at something that embraces the ideals of romanticism but does it in a way that's parody, The Princess Bride has to be the penultimate example.
Yeah.
When it comes to parody of romanticism, it absolutely does it the best. Yeah, I love the conversation about the duel during the duel. That whole segment, which, to be fair, revolutionized the way sword fights have happened in every movie that came after it. But when it happened, it was such a spit in the face to what had been done before that it was amazing.
Yeah. And even also the characters too. The characters themselves are highly romanticized, iconic characters. They're almost avatars of the ideal. The way they're put in, with Wesley being the lowly farm boy who's falling in love with his mistress, kind of thing. It's just it's so well done that it. I don't know. I high praise for The Princess Bride. It just knocks it out of the park.
I want to point something out that just sums up the entire film. Is when she does the whole "as you wish," or Wesley does "as you wish," and the narrator says, and then she realized what he was really saying was "I love you." And the character, rather than rushing down there to help him, just jumps and starts rolling. Like Buttercup is just like whoosh.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, and to use that as an example, I think the kid's reaction to the grandfather telling the story is the same reaction a lot of gamers are going to have if you try to present this type of story. Where's the sports? Where's the combat? What we mean?
Oh, they're kissing. Yeah.
Oh! Like, that's not what I showed up to play this game for. This stinks. And then to a certain point, like, whoa, wait. What happens next? Oh, I thought you weren't interested in this. I think it's a good roadmap too, as a GM, on how you kind of lure your players and everybody into the idea of embracing and putting more romanticism ideals into your gaming as a narrative.
Inconceivable.
You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Well, I mean, another classic example of romanticism, though, to a certain extent, would be the Inigo Montoya character, who, this is a character no one cares about his background. We don't care who his father was. We don't care why he carries around that sword or why he's looking for the six-fingered man until he runs into him. And then all of a sudden, like, all that lore, all that story, all that backstory for a character that really was there to be a foil for the main character matters. And that's another classic example of the way that you can bring that into the game for your players, is introduce a character and don't even invent the backstory until it becomes relevant, and then the backstory becomes the romanticization of that character when your players are ready to engage with it. That's another one of those kind of GM lessons from 30 years of doing this, is come to the table prepared to do something you didn't expect to do that makes the game better, and then allows you to touch on these more classic tropes of the genre that you're trying to play into. Because I think a lot of the time what we worry about when we say, even the way this started was, well, how do you do it without rolling in the players? Do it as a reaction. Do it as a backswing after the fact, when you're, oh, look, they actually engaged with this character. Now what can I do with the character that's interesting?
And I would say too, if you wanted to do a courtship type thing between an NPC and a player character, if you want to introduce a love interest, and when I say that, I mean not in a skeezy, puerile teen boobies kind of way where you're not talking about role playing the actual sexual intercourse or encounter, but you want to actually play out that aspect. You want to have the Han Solo Princess Leia relationship develop. A very easy way to do that is just to use a social conflict rules from Savage Worlds as persuasion rules over time.
Yeah, or I mean, if you really want to get right, if you really wanted to look at that and things, Deadlands Noir has seduction rules that are already there that you could certainly use for that.
Which are a social conflict.
Right, exactly. I was going to say that, and they are a game mechanic that you can just use, and then to me, using that game mechanic, it does that way. It doesn't have to get all weird, and then then you could just, if it goes how they want it to go, then you can just have a sound effect of fireworks ready to play and call it good.
Classic fade to black thing, okay? Yeah, everything builds up to that moment, and it fades to black, and now we're going to go talk to these other players over here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I've done that before in a game. I've just been like, that's just how it's going to go.
And we
fade to black.
And then we come back in time for the next morning and breakfast in bed. Or someone making breakfast.
In the noir era of films, they had to deal with the Hays Code. And if you look at the Hays Code, it specifically talks about nothing suggestive. And I watched a documentary on film noir, and the writers said that they felt, while they were not in favor of censorship, they felt that the Hays Code actually made for better stories because they had to be creative. They couldn't rely on sexuality or profanity, so they had to portray that through the characters' actions and through the setup. And they juxtaposed some scenes from classic film noir with scenes from neo-noir, which came out in the 70s, that didn't have to do that. And I got to say, the classic film noir was much better. Even down to how the mobsters are sort of tongue-in-cheek threatening people, but they've got that code, versus like the 70s noir where they're just pulling out guns and dropping F-bombs. It creates a much more menacing and intense villain if that villain is mindful of their behavior, because they're communicating on a subliminal level. And like the build-up and the tension that comes from sort of having that subliminal communication in film noir definitely improve the story and the characters much more than the neo-noir films, where it was just a box that got opened. Versus the bow had to be taken off and the paper had to be unwrapped. It was much more of a slow, intense burn.
Well, it's the same thing too that a mechanical accident gives Steven Spielberg a lot of praise for Jaws, because you never see the shark until practically 2/3 of the way through the movie before you see the shark. Yeah, because they couldn't get it to work. Mm-hmm. So they had to film around it and make it suggestive with a fin in water or a POV shot underwater. They had to get creative with the way they did it because the tech wasn't working. I would say that too, if you're playing a mobster game, you're going to play a classic, Scorsese style mobster game. You're highly romanticizing Wise Guys.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I mean, even just picking up the actual jumpstart from Just Insert Imagination for Wise Guys, you're going to see a lot of romanticization in there that Eric's worked in based on a lot of time he spent, like, what were the tropes? What's going on? At the same time, and I've spoken with Eric, at length about this, like, there's going to be some stuff in the book that I think is going to shock people about the reality of organized crime. Like, he doesn't pull any punches and hide the grim, gritty, nasty world that is the seedy underbelly of Las Vegas at that time period, because he wants to give you the option to play Dick Tracy or to play, Casino, or, even going worse than Casino, maybe into like the Goodfellas territory. So I think that there's a lot to be said about the fine line of how much romanticism do you put in your game to hit the right tone. Because even the grittiest, most grim game is going to have a romanticized part of it because of the very nature of the dice rolls and abstract game rules. There's nothing we can do to take that out of it.
Yep. All right. Well, we're getting near the end of the hour, so I just want to see, do we have anything else we want to address from chat?
Apparently, we killed C.L. Taylor's father, and
I think Art makes a good point where he says that it's where the heroes are bigger than life and the villains were scary, which I agree. I think that's something that needs to be addressed if you're going to have romanticism, is an equal but opposite force. You have to have a villain with the same level of conviction and skill as the hero, if not greater conviction and skill than the hero. If you have a villain that your hero defeats every single time she meets him, then he's not really a threat, and the third movie is going to suck. Just saying.
All right. Well, on that note, perfect place to wrap it up. And so until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Chris, Dave, and Dustin saying keep rolling, stay savage.